The gallows thirsted under the Arizona sun. Its new pine frame was sweating sticky resin, baking in a heat that made the air shimmer. Down below, on the hard-packed dirt, stood Rosalind Hayes. She was 19 years old. Her hands were bound tight, and a rough burlap sack was waiting to be pulled down over her head, waiting to steal the sky from her for the last time. She was a laundress, an orphan, a girl whose only real crime was being born poor in a town that didn't forgive poverty. But here, in Redemption's Bluff, they called her a murderer. The crowd buzzed with a grim, righteous certainty. Their judgment was as hard and unyielding as the baked earth under their boots. Justice, they whispered to each other, was about to be served. A clean drop and a quick snap. The embrace of a rope. But justice in the West is a funny thing. It's a fickle beast, often swayed not by the truth, but by power, by greed, and sometimes by a bottle of cheap whiskey in the hands of the last soul you'd ever expect. The cell was a clay oven. The air inside was thick, choked with the smell of stale sweat, of fear, and of the finality of dust. Rosalind Hayes sat on the edge of a narrow cot, her thin cotton dress clinging to her skin like a second skin made of dread. She wasn't crying anymore. The tears had run dry hours ago, leaving salty trails on her cheeks that looked like tiny, dried-up riverbeds. Through the single-barred window, she could see a sliver of the sky, a merciless, blinding blue. It was the last sky she would ever see. Her mind, which had been a frantic animal trapped in a cage for the past week, had finally, blessedly, grown quiet. It just replayed the events, not with panic, not anymore, but with a dull, hollow ache that felt heavier than the whole world. Bartholomew Kane. His name was a stain on the town's lips, a name spoken with a mixture of reverence and fear. He was a man of immense wealth. He owned the silver mine that fed the town, the general store that clothed it, and probably half the souls in Redemption's Bluff. To Rosalind, he was just a man with sweat-stained collars on his expensive shirts. He was the man whose leering gaze followed her every time she delivered his clean laundry to the back door of his sprawling ranch house, a gaze that made her skin crawl. The night it happened, the moon was just a splinter in a black, unforgiving sky. She'd been on her way back to the small room she rented above the smithy, her meager day's earnings tied up tight in a handkerchief. That's when Kane had cornered her. In the dark, narrow alley between the saloon and the assayer's office, the smell of whiskey on his breath was a suffocating cloud. His words were thick, slurred promises of coin and comfort. But his eyes held a brutal kind of ownership. "A pretty little thing like you shouldn't be walking alone," he'd grunted. His large hand clamped down on her arm. His grip was like iron. She tried to pull away, her pleas soft and desperate. "Please, Mr. Kane, I have to get home." His laughter was a low rumble, the growl of a predator that knows it has its prey cornered. He pushed her hard against the rough adobe wall, his heavy body pressing her into the grit and grime. Panic, cold and sharp as a knife, pierced straight through her fear. When his hand fumbled with the collar of her dress, she reacted without thought. Her other hand, small and calloused from lye soap and hot water, found a loose brick on the ground beside her. She swung it. She swung it with all the force her terror could muster. It connected with his temple with a sickening, wet thud. Bartholomew Kane, the titan of Redemption's Bluff, the man who owned everything, had crumpled to the ground without another sound. She hadn't waited. She hadn't checked to see what she'd done. She had simply run, her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird, the brick dropping from her numb fingers, forgotten in the dirt. They found her an hour later, cowering in her small room. The sheriff, a weary man named Collier, had a look of genuine pity in his eyes. But it was fleeting. The town's most powerful man was dead, and someone had to pay. A poor, nobody laundress was the perfect candidate. The trial was a joke, a farce. Judge Horatio Blackwood presided, his face a perfect mask of solemn gravity. But his eyes were like chips of flint, cold and hard. He and Kane had been partners. Everyone in town knew it, but it was the kind of fact no one dared speak aloud. Those two men owned the law in this town as surely as they owned the land it was built on. Rosalind had no lawyer. She only had her own terrified, stammering words. She spoke of the assault, of her fear, of the desperate, frantic act of self-preservation. Judge Blackwood listened. His fingers were steepled, his expression never changing. Then he methodically, cruelly dismantled her story. He painted her as a conniving seductress, a harlot who had lured the respectable Mr. Kane into an alley with the intent to rob him. And when the robbery went wrong, she had resorted to murder. He even used her virginity against her, a fact confirmed by the town doctor in a humiliating public examination. It wasn't a sign of her innocence, he'd argued. It was just a cunning part of her deceptive facade. "A wolf in sheep's clothing," the judge had boomed, his voice filling the cramped, sweaty courthouse. "She presents herself as a pure maiden to mask a heart of pure avarice and violence." The jury was made up of 12 men who relied on Kane's mine for their bread and on Blackwood's court for their safety. They delivered their verdict in under 10 minutes. Guilty. Now the sound of hammering echoed from the town square. They were finishing her gallows. Each strike of the hammer was another nail in her coffin, a countdown to the moment her feet would kick against nothing but hot, empty air. Sheriff Collier appeared at her cell door, the jangle of his keys a death knell. "It's time, Rosalind," he said, his voice softer than she deserved. She stood on shaky legs, a strange, hollow calm settling over her. She was innocent. God knew it. And in these final moments, that was the only truth that seemed to matter. She walked ahead of the sheriff, her head held high, out of the darkness of the jail and into the searing, unforgiving light of the town square. The crowd was a sea of faces. Some were hungry for the spectacle. Some were grimly satisfied. A few, just a few, turned away in shame. They parted for her, a silent, morbid procession to the newly built scaffold. At the base of the steps, Judge Blackwood stood, dressed in his black Sunday best, a Bible clutched in one hand. He looked at her, and for a fleeting moment, she saw a flicker of something in his cold eyes. Not malice, something worse, a cold, calculated satisfaction. He had protected his secrets. He had balanced his books. Her life was just the cost of doing business. "May God have mercy on your corrupted soul, child," he said, his voice loud enough for the entire crowd to hear, for the whole world to hear. As the hangman placed the coarse burlap hood over her head, plunging her into a suffocating, scratchy darkness, Rosalind Hayes offered up her final, silent prayer. It wasn't for mercy. It wasn't for salvation. It was a prayer that somewhere, in the great beyond, truth was worth more than silver and power. The noose, stiff and rough, settled around her neck. She felt the hangman's hands on her shoulders, positioning her perfectly over the trapdoor. This was it, the end. The world fell completely silent, holding its breath, waiting for the crack of the lever and the snap of a life extinguished. On the edge of town, where the respectable streets of Redemption's Bluff bled out into sagebrush and cracked earth, sat a man the children called Ghost. He wasn't a spirit, but he may as well have been. He lived in the burned-out shell of an old way station, a forgotten relic from a mail route that no one used anymore. His face was a roadmap of hardship. His skin was the color of burnished copper, weathered by a sun and a sorrow that had bleached all the joy from his eyes. His long black hair was unkempt, streaked with a gray that had come too soon. The townsfolk knew him only as a drunk, the Apache who had wandered in from the desert years ago. A man who traded the occasional, skillfully trapped pelt for a bottle of the cheapest rot-gut whiskey the saloon had to offer. He was a ghost because he moved through their world without ever being a part of it. He was a remnant of a people they had displaced, a silent, walking accusation they chose to ignore by labeling him a worthless drunk. They didn't know his real name was Listening Wind. They didn't know the story that had hollowed him out from the inside. They didn't know about the fever that had swept through his small, isolated band, a sickness brought by a passing patrol, that had stolen his wife, Mourning Dove, and his young son, Little Hawk. He was the only survivor, left to wander with a grief so vast it had swallowed his identity whole. The whiskey didn't make him forget. It just quieted the voices of his dead family for a few blessed, silent hours. On this day, Ghost was sitting with his back against the warm adobe ruin, watching the town through the heat shimmers. He hadn't touched a drop of whiskey since yesterday. The clarity was painful. The world was too sharp, too loud. The buzzing of the flies, the distant clang of the blacksmith's hammer. It was all an assault on his senses. He saw the crowd gathering in the square, a dark clot of humanity, drawn to a public death like vultures to a carcass. He'd seen it before. The white man's justice was a strange and brutal theater. He had no interest in their affairs, their laws, their sins, their redemptions. They were alien concepts to him. His world was governed by the sun, the rain, and the memory of a life that had turned to ash. He was about to turn away, to seek the shade and the solace of the bottle he had hidden, when he saw the girl. She was small, almost childlike, walking with a ramrod straightness that defied the terror that must have been eating her alive. He recognized her. She was the laundress, the quiet one who sometimes left a small bowl of water out for the stray dogs, the one whose eyes held a profound sadness long before this day ever came. He had seen her on the night that Bartholomew Kane had died. Ghost had been in the shadows of the livery, not drunk, but in that painful, raw state of sobering up. He often walked the town at night, a phantom in the moonlight when the world was quiet and he could almost pretend he wasn't alone. He had seen Kane, reeking of cheap perfume and expensive whiskey, pull the girl into the alley. He had heard her frightened pleas. He had started to move. His hand, instinctively, had gone to the knife at his belt. A primal, ancient urge to protect the weak had risen through the thick fog of his apathy. But then he had stopped. He was an Indian, an outcast, a ghost. If he intervened, they would just say he had attacked the great Mr. Kane. They would hang him without a second thought, and they'd probably congratulate themselves for it. So he had watched, his heart a cold stone in his chest, as the girl defended herself. He saw the desperate swing, heard the sickening crack, and watched her flee like a startled doe. He had remained in the shadows, a silent witness to her desperate act of survival. He'd slipped away before the sheriff arrived, melting back into the desert night. He had told himself it wasn't his fight. He had told himself her fate was sealed by her own hand, by the rules of a world that was not his. He'd spent the entire week in a whiskey-fueled haze, trying to drown the image of her terrified face. But now, watching her climb the gallows, the apathy that had been his shield for years began to crack. He saw his wife, mourning dove, in the girl's defiant posture. He saw the innocence of his son, Little Hawk, in her youth. The white man's world had taken everything from him. Now it was about to commit another sin, another casual act of cruelty, and call it justice. They were going to kill this girl for refusing to be a victim. A fire, long dormant, began to smolder in his gut. It was a reckless, foolish ember of a feeling he thought had died with his family. It was rage. It was a sense of rightness. He looked at Judge Blackwood, preening before the crowd like a self-important buzzard. He looked at the hangman, his face hidden by a bandana. He looked at the townsfolk, their faces a mixture of morbid curiosity and righteous bloodlust. And he knew he could not remain a ghost any longer. He stood up, his joints protesting. His mind, clearer than it had been in years, began to work. A direct accusation would be dismissed as a drunkard's raving. A plea for mercy would be laughed at. He needed something else, a challenge they could not ignore, a lever to pry open their closed world. He remembered tales from the old-timers, whispers of the founding of this town, a place called Redemption's Bluff, established by outcasts who had set down their own peculiar laws before the territory government had taken over. A town charter, they called it. A dusty document no one had looked at in 50 years, stored in the back of the clerk's office. He had once helped the clerk move some old furniture and had seen the leather-bound book, its pages yellowed and brittle with age. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble. It would likely get him thrown in jail, or worse, shot on sight. But as he watched the hangman fit the noose around Rosalind Hayes's slender neck, he knew that sitting here and doing nothing was a death of a different kind. It was the death of the last shred of the man he used to be, the man named Listening Wind. He began to walk towards the square. His stride was unsteady at first, then it firmed with purpose. The bottle of whiskey lay forgotten by the ruins. For the first time in a long, long time, Listening Wind was not seeking to numb the world. He was seeking to change it. The silence in the square was absolute. It was thick and heavy, like a woolen blanket in the summer heat. The only sound was the faint creak of the gallows frame as the hangman, a burly man named Peterson, tested his weight near the lever. Rosalind stood on the trapdoor, the world gone black beneath the hood. She focused on her breathing. Each intake of hot, stuffy air was a small rebellion against the inevitable. She could feel the sun on her shoulders, a final warm caress before the cold. Judge Horatio Blackwood raised his hand, a grand signal for the final act. His face was a study in pious solemnity, a performance for the crowd he ruled. In accordance with the laws of this territory, and in the sight of God Almighty, he began, his voice a resonant baritone that carried to the farthest edges of the square. We commit this sinner to her judgment. Let this be a lesson to all who would trade innocence for vice and life for... He was cut off. Stop. The voice was rough, gravelly, and utterly unexpected. It cut through the sanctimonious drone of the judge like a shard of glass. A wave of murmurs rippled through the crowd as they turned, heads craning, searching for the source of the interruption. There, at the edge of the square, stood Ghost. He was a jarring sight against the backdrop of Sunday bonnets and broadcloth suits. His clothes were worn thin, his hair was wild, and he swayed just slightly on his feet. The immediate assumption was clear on every single face. The town drunk had chosen the most inappropriate moment imaginable for a public spectacle. Sheriff Collier took a half step forward, his hand resting instinctively on the butt of his Colt, ready to remove the nuisance. "This is not justice," Ghost called out, his voice gaining strength. He took a step forward, then another, walking into the cleared space before the gallows. He ignored the hostile stares and the whispered insults. His eyes were fixed on one man and one man only, Judge Blackwood. "Remove this drunken fool," Blackwood commanded, his face flushing a deep, angry red at the interruption to his grand moment. "Sheriff, do your duty." Collier started forward, but Ghost held up a hand, a gesture of surprising authority. "I am not here as a drunk," he said, his voice shockingly steady and clear. "I am here as a citizen of this territory, and I challenge this proceeding." A smattering of derisive laughter broke out from the crowd. "On what grounds, you savage?" someone yelled. Ghost ignored them. His gaze never left the judge. "I invoke the Redemption Charter, the founding law of this town." The laughter died instantly, replaced by a confused, shuffling silence. The town charter? It was a half-forgotten myth, a document from the town's wilder, formative years. No one had mentioned it, let alone invoked it, in decades. Blackwood scoffed, a look of pure contempt twisting his face. "The charter is a historical relic. It has no bearing here. We are governed by territorial law, which you have just broken by disrupting a legal execution. Seize him." Two deputies started to move, but Ghost spoke again, his voice ringing with an authority no one had ever heard from him before. "Article 7, he declared, his voice cutting them short. "The right of witness intercession." He let the words hang in the air. "It states that if a new witness comes forward at the final moment with evidence pertinent to the condemned's innocence, the execution must be stayed for a period of 24 hours to examine the claim." He took another step closer. "It is the founding law of redemption's bluff, Judge. Are you saying this town no longer believes in redemption?" The challenge was brilliant. It was direct. It wasn't just to the judge's authority, but to the very name and identity of the town itself. The crowd grew restless. They had come for a simple, clear-cut hanging. This was complicated. This was messy. Blackwood's face was a thundercloud. He knew in some dusty, forgotten corner of his legal mind that the Apache was right. The charter had never been formally nullified. It was a legal loophole, an anachronism, but it was there. To ignore it so publicly, especially after it had been invoked with such precision, would be to show his own disregard for the town's history and laws. It would look tyrannical. "And what possible evidence could a degenerate like you possess?" Blackwood spat, trying to regain control, trying to discredit the man before the idea could take root. "I was there. Ghost said simply. I saw what happened in that alley, and I know she did not commit murder. A collective gasp went through the crowd. Rosalind, under the hood, felt her knees buckle. A sliver of impossible, painful hope pierced through her despair. Was this real, or was it some cruel fever dream in her final seconds? Sheriff Collier paused, his hand still on his gun. He looked from the defiant Apache to his furious superior. Collier was a man who followed orders, but he was also a man with a nagging conscience. The trial had felt rushed. The verdict had felt too neat. Judge, Collier said, his voice low but firm enough to be heard, he's invoked the charter. People are listening. To proceed now. It wouldn't look right. Blackwood's jaw clenched so hard a muscle jumped in his cheek. He was trapped. Trapped by a drunken Indian and a forgotten piece of paper. His eyes darted around the square, seeing the doubt and confusion on the faces of his citizens. He had lost control of the narrative. He glared at Ghost, his eyes promising a painful retribution. Very well, he bit out, the words tasting like poison in his mouth. The law, in all its tedious forms, must be observed. 24 hours. The execution is stayed. He let the crowd absorb the shock. Then he added, pointing a trembling, furious finger at Ghost, but this man will be held in a cell. If his evidence proves to be nothing more than a drunken fantasy, he will be charged with obstructing justice. And I will see to it personally that he is bullwhipped in this very square. Take him away. The deputies, looking relieved to finally have clear orders, grabbed Ghost's arms. He did not resist. As they led him towards the jail, his eyes met Rosalind's for a brief moment. The hangman, looking utterly bewildered, had just removed the noose and hood from her head. In his gaze, she saw none of the pity or contempt she was used to. She saw a flicker of something ancient and fierce, an ember of a promise in the heart of a ghost. She was led back to her cell, her legs barely supporting her. She hadn't been saved. She had only been given a single day purchased by the town drunk, now standing between her and the gallows. The jail now held 2 prisoners. Rosalind was back in her oven-like cell, the metallic taste of fear still coating her tongue. Ghost occupied the one directly opposite. The heavy oak door to the sheriff's office was shut, and through it she could hear the muffled, angry tones of Judge Blackwood berating Sheriff Collier. The words were indistinct, but the fury behind them was unmistakable. Rosalind sat on her cot, her body trembling with the aftershocks of her near-death experience. It felt like a phantom limb, the feeling of the rope still burning on her skin. She stared across the narrow corridor at the man who had bought her this sliver of time. He sat on the floor, his back against the bars, his eyes closed. He looked exhausted, the fire she had seen in the square now banked to a low, weary glow. He didn't look like a savior. He looked like what everyone said he was, a broken man. Why? She finally whispered, her voice hoarse. Why did you do that? They'll hurt you. Ghost opened his eyes. They were a deep, dark brown, and they held an ocean of weariness that seemed older than the mountains. They were already hurting me, he said, his voice a low rumble, just in a different way. He paused, studying her face with an unnerving intensity. You have the eyes of a hunted animal, but you are not a killer. No one would believe me, she said, the familiar despair creeping back in, cold and suffocating. They all believe the judge. The judge tells a story, Ghost replied, his voice flat and even. He is good at it, but a story is just words. The truth leaves tracks. He fell silent for a long moment, listening as the judge's tirade finally sputtered out, followed by the heavy slam of the office door as Blackwood left. A few moments later, Sheriff Collier entered the cell area. His face was grim, his shoulders slumped as if carrying a great weight. He stopped in front of Ghost's cell. You'd better have something, son, he said, his voice heavy with exhaustion. You've kicked a hornet's nest, and Blackwood is the king hornet. He wants your hide, and he's not particular about how he gets it. I have the truth, Ghost said calmly. The truth ain't worth a damn in this town without proof, Collier grumbled, jamming a key into the lock on the cell door. Come on. The judge wants you in his office. Alone. Ghost stood and walked out, giving Rosalind a look that was impossible to decipher. As he was led away, a chilling fear gripped her. This was it. This was Blackwood's chance to threaten him, to beat him, to make him recant his story in a place where no one could see. Inside the office, Judge Blackwood sat behind his large mahogany desk, a fortress of polished wood and leather. His hands were steepled, his face a mask of cold composure. He waited until Collier had left, closing the door firmly behind him. The room was opulent, filled with leather-bound books and expensive maps of the territory. It was a room that radiated power, designed to make any man who entered it feel small. "I am a man who appreciates order," Blackwood began, his voice dangerously soft, a predator's purr. "You, sir, are an agent of chaos. You have made a mockery of my court and undermined the stability of this entire town. I am giving you one opportunity to avoid a great deal of pain." He leaned forward, his eyes like ice chips. "You will go back out into that square. You will tell everyone you were drunk and mistaken, and you will leave this town tonight. If you do that, I will forget this ever happened." Ghost stood silently before the desk, his expression unreadable. He wasn't intimidated by the fancy room or the powerful man. He had faced down starvation, grief, and the brutal indifference of the desert. A man in a suit was nothing. "The girl is innocent," he said, his voice flat. Blackwood's veneer of calm finally cracked. He slammed his hand on the desk, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the silent room. "The girl is a murderer, and you are a drunken liar. What proof could you possibly have? Did you conjure it from the bottom of a whiskey bottle?" "I don't need to conjure it," Ghost said, his voice never rising. "I saw it. I saw Bartholomew Kane assault her. I saw her defend herself. It was not murder. It was survival. Your word against mine. The word of a drunken Indian against the most respected judge in this territory. That is a battle you will not win." Blackwood sneered, regaining some of his composure. Ghost took a small, deliberate step closer to the desk. "It will not be just my word. When a man is surprised, he leaves a trail. When a man plans a lie, he makes mistakes." He leaned forward slightly, his eyes locking with the judge's. "Tell me, Judge, why was there a woman's riding glove, a fancy one made of soft doe skin, found in the mud 50 yards from the alley?" Blackwood's eyes widened. It was almost imperceptible, a flicker of a muscle beneath his eye. But it was there. His composure faltered for a split second. It was a masterful bluff. Ghost had seen no such glove, but he had seen something else that night, something he had been pondering for a week. After Rosalind had fled, and before the sheriff had arrived, a second figure had slipped into the alley. A rider who had dismounted, spent a moment by Kane's body, and then ridden off into the night. It had been too dark to see a face, but he had noticed the horse, a fine, dark mare with a distinctive, smooth gait. The judge's momentary flicker of shock was all the confirmation Ghost needed. He had hit a nerve. There was someone else involved, someone Blackwood was protecting. "I know nothing of any glove," Blackwood said, recovering quickly, his voice turning to ice. "Your time is running out. This bluff of yours will fail." "We will see," Ghost said, turning his back on the judge and walking to the door. 23 hours, Judge. The clock is ticking." He was led back to his cell. Rosalind looked at him, her eyes wide with 100 unspoken questions. "What did he say?" she asked, her voice a whisper. "He is afraid," Ghost said, a note of grim satisfaction in his voice. He looked at her, his gaze intense, as if trying to see into her memory. "The truth is a stone right now. It is at the bottom of a muddy river. We just have to stir the water." He then asked a question that seemed to come from nowhere, completely out of the blue. "The night Kane attacked you, did you smell anything? A perfume? Flowers?" Rosalind frowned, forcing her mind back to the terrifying blur of the assault. Kane had smelled of whiskey and stale sweat. A foul combination. But there was something else. A faint scent she had noticed just before he grabbed her, clinging to his coat like a ghost. "Lavender," she said, her own eyes widening in recognition. "It was faint. I thought it was strange." A slow, grim smile touched Ghost's lips for the very first time. "Lavender," he repeated softly. "The water is getting cloudy, little bird. The stone is starting to move. He knew who in town wore expensive lavender perfume imported all the way from France. There was only one person, the grieving widow, Matilda Kane. News of the state execution and the Apache's bizarre challenge spread through Redemption's Bluff like a prairie fire. The town, once so united in its condemnation of Rosalind, was now fractured, split down the middle. The saloon buzzed with speculation. Men who owed their livelihoods to Judge Blackwood loudly proclaimed the Indian a liar and called for a swift, brutal conclusion. But others, the blacksmith, the stable hands, the women who frequented the general store, began to whisper among themselves. They knew Rosalind Hayes. They knew her quiet dignity, her tireless work. It had always been hard, if they were being honest, to picture her as a cold-blooded killer. Sheriff Collier was caught right in the middle. His loyalty to the judge was a matter of employment and simple survival. But Ghost's words and the judge's intensely volatile reaction had planted a seed of doubt that was rapidly taking root in his mind. After locking Ghost back in his cell, Collier retreated to his office and slumped into his chair, rubbing his tired eyes. He was a lawman, and the law was supposed to be about truth, not convenience. He thought about Ghost's strange, specific question to the judge, the one about a doeskin glove. It was likely a bluff, a shot in the dark, but it was a specific one. On a hunch, he pulled out the meager file on the Kane murder. The list of items found at the scene was short. Kane's body, his wallet still full of money, which had always weakened the robbery motive, and a single pearl button found near the alley's entrance. The button didn't match Kane's waistcoat or Rosalind's simple dress. At the time, he dismissed it as random street detritus, something that had been lying in the dirt for weeks. Now he looked at it again, rolling the small, iridescent object in the palm of his hand. It was fine quality, clearly from an expensive garment. His conscience gnawing at him, Collier made a decision. He walked back to the cells. "Lavender," he said to Ghost, keeping his voice low so Rosalind wouldn't overhear. The girl mentioned lavender. Ghost nodded slowly, his face impassive. "Matilda Kane's perfume, imported from Paris. Everyone in this town knows the scent." "That ain't proof of anything," Collier said, though his tone lacked conviction. "She could have been with her husband earlier in the day." "Ask yourself this, Sheriff," Ghost countered, his voice calm and persuasive. "Kane was a pig. He frequented the saloon girls. He smelled of whiskey and cheap women when he cornered the girl in that alley. Why would a man on his way to meet a harlot wear the scent of his own wife?" The question hung in the air, simple and devastatingly logical. "And the horse," Ghost continued, pressing his advantage. "A dark bay mare, a Tennessee walker, rides smooth as silk. Who in town owns a horse like that?" Collier's face paled slightly. He knew the answer immediately. "Matilda Kane," he whispered. "It was a gift from her husband." "The truth leaves tracks, Sheriff," Ghost repeated. "You just have to be willing to follow them." Steeling himself, Collier left the jailhouse. He could feel the weight of the judge's eyes on him from the courthouse window across the square, but he didn't look back. His first stop was the Kane Ranch, a sprawling property on the west side of town. Matilda Kane, dressed head to toe in expensive black mourning clothes, received him in her parlor. She was a handsome woman, her face a carefully constructed mask of practiced grief. "Sheriff," she said, dabbing a pristine lace handkerchief at her perfectly dry eyes, "to what do I owe this intrusion on my sorrow?" "Just a few follow-up questions, ma'am," Collier said, holding the pearl button between his thumb and forefinger. "We found this at the scene. Do you recognize it?" He saw it, a briefest, sharpest flicker of panic in her eyes before her mask of sorrow slipped perfectly back into place. "Goodness, no," she said, barely glancing at it. "It could belong to anyone." "It's from a woman's riding coat, the seamstress reckons?" Collier pressed on. "A very fine one." "I have been in mourning, Sheriff," she said coolly, her voice dripping with indignation. "I have not been riding." It was a dead end, her word against an anonymous button. Collier left feeling frustrated but more certain than ever. His next stop was the livery stable. He found the young stable hand, a boy named Timothy, brushing down a chestnut gelding. Collier engaged him in casual conversation, asking about the horses before getting to the point. That's a fine mare Mrs. Kane has, Collier said offhandedly. The Tennessee Walker. Yes, sir, Timothy said proudly. Midnight. Fastest horse in the county. Does she ride her much? Almost every evening, the boy replied, not looking up from his work. Likes to ride out as the sun sets. Did so the night Mr. Kane, the night he passed. Came back in a real lather, both the horse and her. Collier's heart hammered in his chest. You're sure it was that night? Yes, sir, Timothy said, his brow furrowed in concentration. I remember 'cause she paid me an extra $1 to rub midnight down and keep quiet about it. Said the judge told her it wouldn't be proper for a grieving woman to have been out riding for pleasure. Seemed odd, but $1's a dollar. The pieces were clicking into place with horrifying clarity. Matilda Kane hadn't been out for a pleasure ride. She had followed her husband, and the judge had told the boy to lie. Collier's last stop was Dr. Finch's office. The old doctor was cleaning his spectacles. Sheriff, he greeted him. Come about the hanging, I suppose. Messy business. I need to ask you about the wound that killed Bartholomew Kane, Collier said, getting straight to the point. The girl, Rosalind, she's a slip of a thing. Kane was a big man, strong. It's plausible, the doctor said, polishing a lens. A lucky strike to the temple with a hard object. The skull is vulnerable there. But is it probable, Collier pressed, that a girl that size in a panic could generate enough force to kill him with one blow? Dr. Finch paused, setting his spectacles carefully on his nose. He looked at Collier over the rims. Probable? No. Possible? Yes, that was my testimony. He leaned forward, lowering his voice. But since you're asking off the record, Sheriff, there was something odd. The contusion was clean. The force was directed at a single, precise point. It felt less like a wild, panic swing, and more like a deliberate, focused strike, almost as if delivered by something heavier and smaller than a brick. He picked up a paperweight from his desk. Say, the butt of a riding crop. The water was no longer just cloudy. It was a raging torrent, and it was carrying Sheriff Collier straight towards a truth that was far more dangerous than the judge's simple story. He now had a motive. Kane's constant philandering. He had means, a riding crop, and he had an opportunity, the stable boy's testimony. Most importantly, he had a cover-up, orchestrated by Judge Blackwood himself. As he walked back toward the jail, the sun beginning to dip towards the horizon, Collier knew his life, and this town was about to get infinitely more complicated. He had to choose between his job and his duty, between the man who signed his paychecks and the truth that was now staring him right in the face. Judge Blackwood watched from his office window as Sheriff Collier moved about the town, his heart pounding with a cold, rising dread. He saw him leave the Kane Ranch. He saw him visit the livery. And finally, he saw him enter the doctor's office. Each stop was another nail being hammered into the coffin of his carefully constructed lie. He had underestimated the Apache. He had seen him only as a drunk, a non-entity, and had failed to recognize the sharp, calculating mind behind the blurry, bloodshot eyes. And he had certainly underestimated Collier's sudden and deeply inconvenient crisis of conscience. You see, Blackwood wasn't merely Kane's friend. They were partners. Partners in a far-reaching criminal enterprise that had its hooks in everything. They controlled the flow of silver from the mine, skimming a significant portion off the top before it was ever recorded. They strong-armed ranchers into selling their land for pennies on the dollar, using threats and legal intimidation. Bartholomew Kane had been the muscle and the public face of their operation, while Blackwood provided the legal cover, twisting the law into a weapon to be used against their enemies. Kane's death hadn't just been the loss of a partner, it was a loose thread that threatened to unravel their entire empire of corruption. Matilda Kane had come to him in a blind panic that night. She had followed Bartholomew to the alley, suspecting him of yet another infidelity. She arrived just after Rosalind had fled, finding her husband stunned but alive, trying to push himself up from the dirt. In a fit of rage born from years of humiliation and simmering abuse, she had struck him with the weighted silver handle of her riding crop, a single precise blow to the temple, right where Rosalind's brick had already weakened him. It was a crime of passion, but Matilda was smart. She knew that with her husband dead, their shared secrets, and his will, which left her everything, were safe. Blackwood had engineered the cover-up. He convinced a hysterical Matilda to go home and say nothing. He coached the stable boy with $1 and a threat. He saw the perfect scapegoat in the terrified laundress, a girl no one would miss and whose story no one would believe. It had been perfect, flawless, until the ghost had decided to speak. Now, raw desperation clawed at him. He couldn't let Collier and the Apache unravel his life's work. He needed to reassert control, and he needed to do it now. His first move was to summon his two most reliable thugs, a pair of hard-faced miners named Roth and Finley, men who were on his private payroll for tasks the law couldn't officially sanction. He met them in the dusty back room of the land office. "The Indian in the town jail," Blackwood said, his voice low and urgent. "He cannot be allowed to speak tomorrow. I want him silenced. A fire, a fight, an accident. I don't care how you do it. Just make sure he doesn't see the sunrise." Roth, a hulking man with a broken nose, grinned a yellow-toothed grin. "A pleasure, Judge." As night fell, a heavy, oppressive darkness settled over Redemption's Bluff. Sheriff Collier sat in his office, the stable boy's words and the doctor's suspicions replaying in his mind over and over. He knew he was standing on a precipice. Confronting the judge was career suicide. In a town Blackwood owned, it could very well be a death sentence. But letting an innocent girl hang while the guilty went free was a betrayal of the badge he wore on his chest. He heard a noise from the cells. It was Ghost, humming a low, tuneless melody. It wasn't a sound of despair, but of patience, like a hunter waiting in a blind. "You expect trouble?" Collier said, walking to the cell block door. Ghost stopped humming. "The judge is a rattlesnake. You have cornered him. He will strike." The words sent a chill down Collier's spine. He checked his revolver, making sure it was fully loaded. He lit a second lamp, chasing the deepest shadows from the small building. He was no longer just a jailer. He was a guardian. Around midnight it came, a flicker of orange light from the back of the building, followed by the acrid, unmistakable smell of smoke. Collier burst out the back door to see a pile of oil-soaked rags burning fiercely against the rear wall of the jail. It was a clumsy attempt, meant more as a distraction than anything else. As he ran to stamp out the flames, Roth and Finley emerged from the darkness of the alley, heavy clubs in hand, in charge for the front door. But Ghost had been waiting. The moment he smelled the smoke, he was on his feet. As Finley fumbled with the lock on the front door, Ghost ripped the thin mattress from his cot, tore it open with his bare hands, and dumped the straw filling onto the floor. When Roth finally kicked the door in, he was met with a cloud of dust and straw that Ghost kicked into the air, momentarily blinding him. In that split second of confusion, Ghost slammed his own cell door outwards, straight into Roth's face, sending the big man staggering back with a cry of pain. Finley rushed past his partner, swinging his club wildly into the cell block. Ghost, with the agility of a cat, dodged the blow and used the bars of his own cell for leverage, launching a powerful kick into Finley's side. The man gasped, the air driven from his lungs, and collapsed in a heap. By the time Collier got back inside, gun drawn, the fight was already over. Roth was on the ground nursing a bloody nose, and Finley was groaning on the floor. Ghost stood calmly in his open cell, not even breathing heavily. "The rattlesnake strikes," he said quietly. Collier stared at the scene, the smoke, the groaning men, the silent Apache. All his doubts, all his fears, coalesced into a single hard point of certainty. There was no more middle ground. He had to pick a side. He pointed his Colt at the two thugs. "On your feet," he ordered, his voice ringing with a newfound authority he didn't know he possessed. "You're both under arrest, and you're going to tell me exactly who sent you." He then looked at Ghost, not as a prisoner, but as an ally. "The sun will be up in a few hours. The judge's 24-hour deadline will be over. What's our next move?" Ghost's eyes glinted in the lamplight. "The judge wants a show," he said. "We will give him one, but the story will be ours." The morning sun rose on a town simmering with tension. The square began to fill again, but the mood was completely different from the day before. The morbid certainty was gone, replaced by a restless, anxious curiosity. Word of the attempted arson at the jail had spread like wildfire. whispered from neighbor to neighbor, fueling the growing suspicion that there was much more to this story than Judge Blackwood had told them. At the stroke of 8, the appointed hour, Judge Blackwood emerged from the courthouse. His face was a mask of cold fury, his eyes scanning the crowd for any sign of dissent. He had spent the night in a state of controlled panic after his thugs failed to return. He knew this was his last chance to crush the narrative that was spiraling out of his control. He took his place on the courthouse steps, a makeshift pulpit overlooking the gallows. "The 24 hours have expired," he boomed, his voice straining to project a confidence he no longer felt. "The drunken ramblings of a savage have produced nothing of substance. The verdict of the court stands. Sheriff, bring out the prisoner Rosalind Hayes, and let us proceed with this long-delayed justice." Sheriff Collier did not move from his position by the jailhouse door. Instead, the door opened and Ghost stepped out. Not in chains, but walking freely. He was followed by Collier, who was escorting not Rosalind, but Roth and Finley, their hands bound and their faces bruised. A gasp rippled through the crowd. "There will be no hanging today, Judge," Collier announced, his voice steady and clear, carrying across the stunned silence of the square. "But there will be justice. These men have confessed to attempting to silence a witness last night, on your orders." Blackwood's face turned ashen. "Lies! The desperate accusations of criminals coerced by a rogue sheriff." "Is it a lie, Judge?" Ghost's voice cut through the air. He walked to the center of the square, holding something in his hand. He commanded the attention of every single person there. He was no longer the town drunk. He was an orator, a warrior. "A story was told in your courthouse," he began, his voice calm and measured. "A story of a greedy girl and an innocent man. But the truth leaves tracks. Let me tell you another story." He told them of what he saw: Kane's brutal assault, Rosalind's desperate act of self-defense. "But that is not where the story ends," he said, his eyes finding Matilda Kane, who stood near the back of the crowd, her face pale and drawn. "Because Bartholomew Kane was not dead when the girl fled." He recounted the evidence Collier had gathered, laying it out piece by painful piece for the whole town to see. He spoke of the lavender perfume, a scent clinging to a man who was on his way to a cheap liaison. He spoke of the fine pearl button that matched the missing one from Matilda Kane's expensive riding coat. He presented the stable boy's testimony of her frantic late-night ride, and then he held up the object in his hand. It was a handsome riding crop with a heavy silver-weighted handle. "Dr. Finch," Ghost called out, "would a blow from this object be consistent with the fatal wound on Mr. Kane's temple?" The old doctor, standing near the front, nodded grimly. "More consistent than a brick, I'd wager." All eyes turned to Matilda Kane, her composure finally shattered. The mask of grief she had worn for days twisted into a snarl of pure, undiluted hatred. "He deserved it!" she shrieked, her voice cracking with years of repressed fury. "The pig! He humiliated me for years. He flaunted his women. He beat me. He treated me like property. I found him in that alley, still alive, and I finished it. I'm glad I did." Her confession ripped through the square, stunning the crowd into a dead silence. Then she pointed a trembling, accusing finger at the judge. "And he told me to keep quiet. He helped me. He said he'd pin it on the laundress. He couldn't risk the secrets dying with Bartholomew. The land grabs, the stolen silver. He's as guilty as I am." The spell was broken. The town's rigid, brutal order collapsed into chaos. Judge Horatio Blackwood, exposed and cornered, made a desperate final move. He drew a small Derringer pistol from his coat and aimed it at Sheriff Collier. But he was too slow. Ghost moved with a speed that defied his years of apathy, tackling the judge hard and sending him sprawling into the dust. The Derringer fired harmlessly into the air. In an instant, the town turned on its fallen idol. The very men Blackwood had cheated and threatened surged forward, surrounding him, their faces masks of rage. Sheriff Collier, with the help of the blacksmith, managed to restrain the judge, slapping iron cuffs on the wrists that had, just hours before, held the power of life and death over them all. Rosalind was brought out of her cell, not as a condemned prisoner, but as a survivor. She blinked in the bright sunlight, her eyes finding ghosts in the churning crowd. Their gazes met across the square. He gave her a single, almost imperceptible nod. He had not done it for her, not really. He had done it for the memory of his own lost family, for the last flickering ember of the man he once was. He had stirred the waters and brought the truth to the surface. But this was their river, not his. As the townsfolk dealt with the messy, violent aftermath of their broken justice, ghosts slipped away, unnoticed. He walked back to the burned-out way station at the edge of town. He picked up the unopened bottle of whiskey he had left behind, held it for a long moment, and then poured its entire contents onto the thirsty ground. He didn't belong here. He was still a ghost, a man between two worlds, belonging to neither. But as he turned his back on Redemption's bluff and began to walk toward the distant, hazy mountains, he walked with a straighter back. His own redemption had not been found in a town's forgotten charter, but in the simple, terrifying act of speaking a truth no one else would. And for the first time in a very long time, the ghosts of his past walked with him not as accusers, but as companions. And so the tale of Redemption's bluff comes to a close. It's a story that reminds us that heroes are rarely the ones in shining armor. Sometimes they're the outcasts, the forgotten ones, the people society has written off. It shows us that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the act of speaking truth in the face of it, even when your voice shakes. The West was filled with countless stories like this, tales of quiet desperation, shocking injustice, and unexpected salvation that are buried under the dust of history. These are the stories we aim to uncover, to bring back into the light. If this journey into the raw heart of the Old West moved you, please consider helping our community grow. Hit that like button to let us know you were here. Share this story with someone who appreciates a tale of true grit, and most importantly, subscribe to the channel. Every subscription ensures that more of these forgotten legends get a voice. Thank you for listening, and until our next tale, may your trails be true.